So far, I've touched upon Sonic the Hedgehog 1, 2, and 3, and Sonic & Knuckles. That takes care of the most popular of the Sonic games. But this week, I'll be checking out 2 more Genesis games. These are Sonic 3D Blast and Sonic Spinball. We'll start with Sonic 3D Blast. It's a fun game, but definitely has a different style to it. Instead of your side-to-side platforming style, this one plays in an overhead 3D view. As such, the objectives are a bit different. Instead of just going from one end of the stage to another, you are set to save the flickies being held by the destroyable enemies. For those that don't know, the flickies are these little birds. These flickies were also featured in their own game, simply called Flicky. That's another story for another time though. Anyway, Sonic visits the island to see the flickies and finds nothing but robots, so he puts 2 and 2 together. In order to complete each stage, Sonic needs to find flickies in batches of 5 and grab the large horizontal ring. This will either unlock the way to the next part of the level, or transport Sonic to the next stage. As with previous Sonic games, Act 3 of every zone is a boss stage in which you fight Robotnik. These battles are fairly difficult, but it's not necessarily due to Robotnik himself. See, with the 3D style, the controls are fairly strange. Sometimes it's hard to judge jumping distance. More often, it's hard to properly land on smaller platforms due to the speed. Sonic is his usual speedy self, so when jumping you need to rely on the shadow to know where you land. This doesn't always cause problems, but in some zones there will be narrow platforms that Sonic needs to maneuver. These can be utterly frustrating, especially when there's a hazard below the platforms. The best example of this is the Volcano Valley zone. Miss a jump, hit lava, lose your rings, and flickies. This reminds me, flickies function sort to the rings. They don't act as a second chance, but instead, the flickies will scatter when Sonic gets damaged. You'll then be forced to pick them back up. Each flickie has a color assigned to it, and each color has a different movement pattern. The purple one will fly away from Sonic in fear, whereas the red one will just hop around from point to point, back and forth. I think it was the blue one that actively seeks Sonic out. It's something to keep in mind when you're trying to collect your pals from a hit. So I've already said that the flickies come from enemies. This poses part of an issue with the controls, but it's not as bad as the platforming. There's only a small amount of enemies that force you to jump on them. Instead, many of them can be killed simply by rolling into them. It makes it much easier to regain your captive flickies. Rings are found all over the stages, and just like in previous games, there are bonus games that can be accessed by having 50 or more rings. The catch is that to enter these bonus stages, you need to surrender these rings to either Tails or Knuckles, who are hiding in secret and out-of-the-way areas. When you find one of them, Sonic will give them all of his rings. If it's higher than 50, he'll enter the bonus stage. If it's less than 50, he'll still give the rings over, but it counts towards a cumulative total. So if you give Tails 20 rings and then 30 rings later, you'll still enter the bonus stage. However, Tails and Knuckles have separate counts. So if you give Tails 20 rings and then Knuckles 30, you won't enter the bonus stage just based on that. So what about this bonus stage? Well, you're back to an overhead view where Sonic is on a bridge grabbing rings and passing checkpoints. In this regard, it's very similar to Sonic 2's special stage, but it's much easier. You get a better view of the playing field, and there's not as many obstacles in your path. The trail itself is fairly narrow, and you'll be forced to jump ledges at times. There's also an abundance of rings, so getting the right amount to pass a checkpoint shouldn't be an issue. This special stage is one of the easiest in the series, so getting all of the Chaos Emeralds really shouldn't be a problem. Unfortunately, it just allows you to get the best ending, since there is no Super Sonic in here. You can also enter this special stage multiple times. If you clear it more than once, you're rewarded with an extra life. I may as well talk about the Sonic tokens you find floating around too. I really don't know what these do. They are also found during the stages, but they don't seem to do much unless you obtain a few of them. Usually, they're just out of reach on springs, so you'll need to obtain 3 to 5 flickies and have them grab the token for you. My best guess is that if you get 10 of them, they give you a continue, but I can't say that with complete certainty. One slight downgrade to the series is the lack of a slave system. I can only assume that this is because it wasn't made by Sega, but instead Traveler's Tales, a company also responsible for Sonic R, a racing game made for Sega Saturn, and more recently a lot of the LEGO games. The save system would have been nice to have, or at least some sort of a password system. The game isn't incredibly long, allowing you to complete it in about an hour and a half or so, but it still would have been a nice feature, considering that Sonic 3 included it. One thing that Sonic 3D Blast did sort of remove is the time limit. You're still timed, although it's not displayed on the screen. Instead, this time is just used for a time bonus at the end of each stage. The quicker you complete a level, the more points you acquire. So in a nutshell, although there is a time limit of sorts, it doesn't force you to hurry through each stage, which is good considering that each level has a maze-like design. Let me touch on the bosses quick. I've already mentioned the quirks with the controls, and perhaps that's why the game's bosses have a challenge to them. Most of the time, you'll have to leap towards Robotnik's cockpit, in which you can see the protective glass start to shatter, displaying how close you are to defeating him. The problem is that it can be hard to judge the true depth of where the weak point is. Many times, you may jump towards Robotnik, think that you're going to hit the right spot, but then fall to the side and get yourself hurt. It takes some practice and patience, but just make sure that you keep going after a few rings after you get hit, and you'll be fine. I'm going to quickly discuss the final boss. It's only shown if you found all 7 of the Chaos Emeralds. It's a fairly odd battle that favors patience over aggression, since you have to wait till the wave of attacks are done before damaging Robotnik. After you damage Robotnik once, he moves onto a new room, so Sonic gives chase. This pattern continues and even loops. Once you understand each room's pattern of attack, you'll find that Robotnik is pathetically easy. As for the ending, although the opening intro is animated, the ending is just a bunch of still shots. Talk about lame. The visuals of Sonic 3D Blast are pretty impressive. The water, ice streams, and lava falls all look great. Sonic has some good detail to him, and the rotating rings look pretty impressive. Robotnik's contraptions often have a slightly bland look, and I don't understand the tiled look to all the floors in the game. Why not just use a solid color with a bit of texture? Also, some of the later stages look dull, because they're all supposed to take place in a machine or factory. It's just called Gene Gadget Zone, so I'm not even sure what it's supposed to be. Overall, Sonic 3D Blast isn't a bad game, but it gets fairly stale near to the end. It's a fun concept, but a bit more variety in the puzzles or action would have been a good idea. Also, a bit more leeway with the controls or a higher jump would have been nice. And why can't I play as Tails or Knuckles? Oh well. These are really minor issues, because when you get down to it, the game is quite fun. It can easily kill a few hours if you're bored. My score for Sonic 3D Blast? 7 out of 10. So now we move on to part 2 of this week's review. It's a game that I want to like, I really want to like it a lot, but it's just so flawed that it just pisses me off. It's Sonic Spinball. When you get down to it, Sonic Spinball is a pinball game where you have a bit more control over the ball, which just so happens to be Sonic. Just like Sonic 3D Blast, it completely strays off the beaten path for the series, instead of opting for a slower pinball setting. That's not to say it's a bad idea, but as I said, it has some serious problems. First, you don't get too much of a story. All you're shown is Sonic riding on his plane, getting shot down, and falling into the water. When you start the game, he enters almost what looks to be a sewer crossed with a chemical plant. Naturally, you know you need to get to Robotnik, but the way it's done is by having Sonic become a pinball and get flung all over the place. As such, the gameplay is just like a pinball cabinet. Rings are obtained solely for points, and Sonic cannot be damaged in traditional methods. Instead, he's only defeated when he drains down a pit. When this happens, the level is completely reset, excluding the Chaos Emeralds you may have found. Sonic then needs to clamber his way back to where he left off to get the rest of the emeralds. Speaking of the Chaos Emeralds, that's the only way you can reach Robotnik. Technically, his room is always unlocked, but unless you've found all of the Chaos Emeralds on stage, Sonic is thrown out of it immediately. These Chaos Emeralds are often easy to find, but difficult to figure out how to actually reach them. Stage 1 and 2 have 3 emeralds, where 3 and 4 have 5. Once you reach Robotnik's room, you will have to defeat him like he's a standard boss. If you get thrown out of the room, it's not the end. You can just work your way back up to it. If you die, on the other hand, you'll need to start from the beginning and work your way back up. Part of the problem with this is that the game doesn't give you much of a heads up in the way of dangers. The first level isn't too bad, but once you start the second table, Sonic sometimes gets so much speed that you can't properly react to impending doom. Because of this, Sonic may miss a platform that you were shooting for, plummet quickly down a side chute, and then fall into lava, because you can't see where he's going. It essentially requires memorization to the table to know which direction to move towards to avoid death. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be fine once you learn the table. Like many other pinball games, this one is incredibly choppy. Smooth doesn't seem to be a word that can be used here. You'd think that when Sonic is rolled into a ball he'd be able to move logically, but that's not the case. Sometimes bouncing off the walls will just have Sonic float backwards slowly. Other times he'll get propelled to the other side of the room. It's not consistent, making it impossible to learn the basics of the game. Probably because there are none. There's also fairly little animation to it, and what you do have is really sketchy. Sonic's movement is jerky, and although there's little reason to use the spin dash, it really looks half-assed. Unlike traditional pinball games, Sonic Spinball does take advantage of its console style and adds in enemies. Although these enemies can't harm Sonic, they are obstacles nonetheless. They serve just as a roadblock, and Sonic can typically dispatch them on one strike, although some of them will immediately regenerate until a certain puzzle is solved. I can honestly say that most of the time, they function more as an annoyance than an obstacle. Since they move around, you can typically just maneuver around them. Supposedly, there is a bonus if you collect all the rings on a stage, but it's not required. Instead, you always have access to a minigame after each table is cleared in which Sonic can earn an extra life. Basically, it's another pinball game, but this one is a bit more of a typical one. A few capsules are in the back of the level, and Robotnik is flying around the center. You're tasked to break open each one of those containers to free one of Sonic's friends. Clear them all and you get an extra life. There's no continues, passwords, or save system, so you're going to need these lives. There is a cheat that you can put in to give you a stage select, but it is hidden, so if you were playing the game back before the days of the internet, you may have never known that it even existed. In any case, the game is hard. Very hard. With the lack of a real smooth gameplay, it can be frustrating to get Sonic where you want him to. Because of this, it's easy to miss areas and then fall to your death. The thing is, I love pinball, and I would say I'm fairly good at it. But this game just pisses me off due to its mechanics, because although pinball could be considered as repetitive if you're not a fan, this game goes way beyond that. Sonic Spinball could be considered mundane and boring. Years ago, I could get to the final Robotnik boss, but on my latest playthrough, I can't even get past the second table. I used the stage select code to show you what the third and fourth stages look like, but I didn't really play them long enough because honestly, I was starting to get fed up with the game. Sonic Spinball was a great idea in theory, but the execution just wasn't performed well. It ended up being a mess of a game, and one that can really be passed on. If you're in the mood for a pinball game, go find a real pinball table or check out the Pinball Arcade on Steam. Now, that's a real pinball game. My score for Sonic Spinball? 5 out of 10. Next week is the final week of Sonic September. We'll be moving on from the Sega Genesis and instead attack games from 2 of the console's add-ons. This is Reaper. As always, check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/ReapersReviews. Happy fragging.